Hello. I'm going to talk to you this evening about the dark side of creativity. So I think we've spent the whole day hearing about creativity. And we are told that we need to be more creative, that we need to have more creativity. But my argument this evening is going to be that that might not always be necessarily a good thing. In particular, I'm going to be critical of a certain type of rhetoric about creativity, which focuses on individual creative talent, novelty, change. And I'm going to argue that creativity can, in that sense, sometimes be quite destructive, even toxic, both for individuals and for organisations, and that we might need something, perhaps, to counterbalance against these tendencies, which I'm going to call uncreativity. Although, as you will see, I'm going to argue that uncreativity is actually an integral part of creativity. So, everybody wants to be creative. Governments want it. Businesses want it. The creative industries generate, according to the stats, you probably might have heard these before, £84.1 billion of gross value added for the UK economy in 2014 and are growing at nearly twice the rate as the rest of the economy. Businesses want to be creative. They want to have a creative edge in the way that their products are designed. They're looking at innovation in business strategy and business process as well as in product innovation. Governments in China and Taiwan are trying to reorient their economies from making things to creating brands. We all want to be creative. And the focus in all of this is having something, having an output, focusing on what creativity does rather than what it is and how it works. There's no greater compliment then to say to somebody, you're creative. And there's no greater insult than saying, you're really uncreative. This here is a van that was parked near my house in Kentish Town. I don't know whether you can see, but it says Creative Cars and Couriers. And it got me wondering, are the people who drive the van very creative? Are they out-of-work actors? Are they delivering artwork to people? Are they exclusively dealing with the digital design industry? What's going on here? It turns out it is just a van that you hire. I looked it up on their website. That's where I got the picture from. Andy Pratt and Paul Jeffka, Andy Pratt of this parish, I think, has talked about creativity as a kind of magic dust that gets sprinkled over products, policies, businesses, and makes them seem special. John Tusa, on the other hand, has referred to creativity as political margarine, something that just gets slathered over whatever you want, a bit like the way we used to use community in the same way. And it's become so diluted by overuse, this term creativity, that it's almost ceased to mean anything at all. So, what does it mean? Well, could go on forever on this, but briefly, at roots, most of the theoretical literature on creativity says two things. Creativity must be novel, it must produce something new, and it must produce something that has value or that is useful. And those two criteria relate to two different types of thinking. And one of the challenges of creativity is that it requires perhaps contradictory types of thinking, certainly paradoxical types of thinking, the ability to connect together across boundaries in organisations and boundaries in our own brains. And that's something that requires a certain flexibility of thought. Frank Barron called it tolerance of contradiction, the ability to hold two different ways of thinking and ideas in your mind. It's multidimensional. It's difficult, actually, to do these things simultaneously. And not only that, it's further complicated by the fact that novelty and value are not very useful measures because they're always dependent upon the context. What's new or what's valuable will depend upon where and to what purpose this creative act is being enacted. So it might not be very creative in the wrong time or the wrong place. It might actually be quite destructive. It's a similar story with innovation. innovation, if we say innovation is the application of creative ideas, then again we have this tension between two different tendencies, two different mentalities. The discovery and the research around new ideas, and then their implementation, sometimes laborious crafting and application of those ideas. And again, it's going to depend upon resources and applications as to how that works. It's going to be a relative definition rather than absolute as to what is innovative. So I've been talking about outcomes, and I'm going to now move on to talk a little bit about process, about not what creativity is, but what it does. So here we have a kind of flow diagram. I mean, there are lots of different versions of this one could have done, lots of different headings one could use. The important thing to observe here is, firstly, there are a series of steps in this process: ideation, evaluation, implementation, iteration. Some of them are more focused on meeting criteria of novelty. Some are more focused on criteria of value. Notice that this is a circle, not a line. It's not a linear process. The creative process is actually, it's iterative. You try something, it doesn't work. You try it again, you do it better. Notice also that having ideas, the ideation bit over there, is only one part of the story. And actually, having ideas is not really the essence necessarily of creativity. Nick Hornby, the novelist who you may know, is often asked, where does he get his ideas from? And he says, I have no problem having ideas. Don't you have lots of ideas? Ideas come all the time. I have 5 or 6 ideas for a book a week. It's choosing which of those ideas I'm actually going to work up and turn into a story and put the time into. That's the decision-making around evaluating and recognising what kind of book he can write. That's the really difficult part of that process. So notice also that the kind of evaluation, the filtering, the implementation, these are parts of the process we might say, well, that's not very creative, that's not having ideas, that's a bit uncreative. You're nodding your head, you're jumping ahead to my punchline already, it's all right. So these kind of filters and blocks on and criticisms of creativity are, in this model, part of the process. But notice that we don't live in a state of flow here. We're not in the Maslow peak experience all the time. We are actually going in and out of different ways of thinking. We are having moments where we're lying in the bath having eureka moments, and we're also having moments where we're having to plod through some really boring stuff to make something work. However, what we tend to have in a lot of businesses, in a lot of our policies around the creative industries, in education, in schools, is a very different model of creativity that doesn't fit with that complex, multidimensional model I was just outlining. Very often, too often, creativity is associated with a special type of person, a creative person. A special type of thinking, left brain, intuitive, sorry, right brain. I always get that mixed up. And also with a particular stage in the process, the coming up with the idea, the breakthrough thinking, the disruptive innovation, the moment of inspiration, the radical transformation. And when I'm critical of creativity, as I'm going to be over the next little few minutes, this is what I'm really being critical of, this mythic idea of creativity, this false dichotomy really around creativity that separates out one part of the process, one member of the team from the rest and says this is what creativity is. What happens when we do this, when we separate out this version of creativity from all the rest of the things that I was saying you need to make creative processes happen? What happens when we pursue novelty for its own sake, when we ignore the real complexity of creativity and pursue instead this idea of ideation alone? We get a one-sided partial version of creativity, I think, which is toxic both for individuals and for organisations. Let's talk about individuals first. So part of this rhetoric then is that creative people are different. So you do your Myers-Briggs test. Are you creative or are you not creative? This goes back a long way. We can take this all the way back to Plato. But for the purpose of this, I'm going to go back to Freud, who in Creative Writers and Daydreaming describes creative people as like children who haven't grown up, who haven't adapted to the real world, who are still playing. And he says they're dysfunctional. They don't fit. They're a bit strange. It's a short jump from there to some of the theories around creativity as a kind of mental illness or madness. And there's a huge literature around that. So you have people like Lombroso measuring people's skulls to find out whether they're mad and whether they're creative. You have Galton, Darwin's brother-in-law, developing a similar kind of argument in the 19th century. So we start to evolve an idea of creative person as a creative type, living a creative lifestyle. It becomes a role that people have to live up to, quite painfully sometimes, quite self-destructively. Jimi Hendrix, Van Gogh, Arthur Rimbaud. Not that Rimbaud, the other one. And it can also become a way of justifying and excusing dysfunctional, selfish and self-regarding behaviour. So the old Cyril Connolly quote about the pram in the hallway being the enemy of creativity, it of course cuts both ways. Because there's an assumption here that if you want to be creative, you can't engage with everyday things like childcare, babies, prams. Another component in this is the question of motivation and self-belief, because this is partly about a myth that's installed in the minds of creative individuals. Teresa Amabile, who's the Harvard Business School professor who's written a lot about motivation, theories of motivation in creativity, says that in order to be creative, you have to be intrinsically motivated. In other words, you have to want to do it out of a sense of task fulfillment and self-actualization. And if you offer somebody external rewards, or indeed external punishments, you distract them. You crowd out their intrinsic motivation. You can't make somebody be creative. And consequently, there's a tendency then for people working in the creative industries and people who want to be creative to consider that they need to block out those outer voices in the outside world. They need to have faith in their talent. They need to have self-belief. Alfred Bandura talks about self-efficacy beliefs in childhood. And Amabile too talks about childhood as being where this comes from. You have to convince yourself that you're creative when you're young, because God knows people are going to knock it out of you when you're older. So you have to hold on to this. And of course, it's important, it's necessary to protect yourself against the rebuffs and rejections you're going to have through your life. But it also is perhaps a little bit dangerous, even a little bit delusional, because you are no longer connecting with the external critic. The only critic is the inner critic that sits on your shoulder and advises you. That's the only person that you can listen to, according to this. This creativity delusion then has consequences, particularly in the creative workforce. So you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with descriptions of precarious labour, exploitation, people going to work in the creative industries with very unrealistic expectations as to what they're going to do when they get there. This is concern for me and probably for some of you as educators. We're preparing these young people to go out into this world where they're going to be exploited and self-exploiting in particular. As a parent as well, I worry about it too. The old "don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington" line comes to mind. And this tendency towards self-exploitation, it actually has a carry-through in not only for the individuals themselves, but also to those who are wanting to break into the industry. And I think this is a particular problem, by the way, not for everybody. I'm not generalising saying all creative people are self-deluded and mad. I just want to be clear on that. What I'm arguing is that there is a certain myth that I think is very seductive, particularly to young people trying to get into the creative industries, which encourages them to work for nothing, which, as Ulrich Beck describes it, encourages them to take on work that they wouldn't take on because it is discursively sweetened by what Ros Gill has described as the creative industries being seen as cool, creative and egalitarian, when they're really not. This also has the effect, perhaps, of alienating some people who don't have this resource, not only the financial resource, but also the resource of self-confidence and self-belief, to think that they can be this genius figure. So you'll be familiar with the discussions fairly recently about the lack of diversity in the creative workforce. Overwhelmingly privileged, middle class, white, male, like me, actually. And this is perhaps partly to do, certainly a lot to do with resources, but is also perhaps also to do with mental resources as well. And those who do not have that mental confidence regard themselves as uncreative. They don't fit the mold. They don't fit the myth. There are consequences too of this creativity delusion for the process itself. Because if you actually have an excess of self-belief, if you're impervious to criticism, this perhaps leads you to not take seriously some aspects of the task, to underestimate certain types of the task, to be inflexible, to be unmanageable. And actually, I would say these are the very opposite of what we would say creativity should be. So this mythical idea of creativity starts to take you away into this different space, very detached from the real process of creativity, into a kind of toxic mythical view of creativity, which I think infects particularly younger people wanting to work in these industries. I think it's also a problem in HR as well. Which leads on to, what about organisations? How do organisations respond to this mythic idea of creativity? Well, first of all, I think there is a tendency to pursue change for its own sake, to commit to radical transformation rather than incremental change, and to believe that is where real creativity happens. That is where real leadership happens. The sort of square-jawed, heroic idea of leadership fits with a heroic idea of creativity. So the innovator's dilemma, Clayton Christensen's argument discussion about disruptive technologies, talks about the problems that businesses have of adapting to rapid change and creative interventions, and particularly technologies. Because they're wedded to existing resources, customers, ways of doing business, and it's very difficult for them to adapt. And when they do adapt, they then find themselves caught out by the next change. So the innovator's dilemma is not really innovate or die, it's innovate and die, pretty much, seems to me. And the other way of reading Christensen is to say, well, actually, maybe this idea of radical disjunction and rupture is not as useful as thinking more around a more gradualist approach to organisational change, which I think you're going to talk about later as well, in bits, yeah. And it finally can also lead organisations to misunderstand how creative teams and processes work. So to underestimate, for example, the contribution of the supposedly uncreative member of a creative team. To try to jump onto the next big idea and the next big thing rather than trying to eke out and adapt the old idea. So the old Michael Curtin's arguments that we need adapters as well as innovators in a creative team starts to become blurred by this mythic idea of creativity. We start to want to change. BlackBerry starts putting its stupid touchscreen on top of its phones, and nobody likes it because BlackBerry aren't very good at making touchscreen phones. They want their keyboards back. That's what BlackBerry users like. But it's innovation, it's change, it's moving with the times, it's responding to disruptive innovation, competition, etc. And the creative organisation can misunderstand the importance of craft, attention to detail, implementation, and can overvalue ideas over their implementation. So, what is to be done? Well, first of all, this is a false separation, and I have kind of been stringing you along with a straw man argument to some extent in order to make this point. I admit to this now, halfway through. Because The creativity I've just been describing is not real creativity. It's short-term, it's self-regarding. And creativity actually needs uncreativity. So this here we've got sort of right brain, left brain, convergent, divergent. A lot of the things on this side are the things we might consider to be uncreative, that fits with the stereotype of somebody who's blocking ideas, bureaucratic, slow, laborious, and all the exciting, cool, creative stuff is over there. Well, they both need each other, of course. So it's not an either-or. It's actually moving between these thinking styles. And the ability to hold together again these contradictory ways of thinking, these paradoxical ways of thinking, is the mark of how creativity works. So it's not the kind of madness and spontaneity and flow. It's the kind of regathering after the madness and the dream. It's the waking up from the dream. It's not an individual self-generating process, it's a collective process. And the role of the manager is very important in all of this, and leaders and managers, because they're the people that very often have to make these connections, broker these relationships, draw together these different components in the team. So let's consider the role of uncreativity in the creative process. So when I talk to writers, theatre directors about their process, they'll talk a lot, actually, about negative emotions, about failure, about doubt, self-doubt, criticism. Jonathan Franzen wrote recently about this whole idea of being ashamed, feeling he's a failure, being something that really drives him as a writer. Jonah Lehrer wrote about how being blocked unblocks another part of your brain. So Bob Dylan was very productive after a period where he'd been entirely unproductive. So these frustrations and blocks are part of the process. And artists actually are very good at shaping negative experiences and emotions and giving them artistic form. And being blocked and being frustrated is part of that process. Kubla Khan, you may know the story of this. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan, he had quite a lot of opium, as he did, and the correlation between creativity and drug taking is another topic, which we can do in the bar later. And he then fell asleep and he had a dream, and then he woke up and he started writing feverishly, getting this dream down, and then there's a knock at the door. And it's the person from Porlock coming to interrupt him. Goes downstairs, opens the door, walks upstairs, it's all gone. He's forgotten everything. So all we're left with is this beautiful fragment of a poem. It's a great story, but it's not true. Because literary historians have discovered that there were successive drafts of this poem, actually, with things crossed out and rewritten. And actually, Coleridge was himself the person from Porlock. He embodied the uncreative stereotype who was interrupting himself and crossing himself. And the whole thing was designed as a fragment anyway. But that's not such a good story, so that's not the story that he chose to tell. What does this mean for leaders? Well, leaders have a really important role in this, particularly in organisations, obviously. Carl White described leaders as storytellers, sense makers, people who tell the story of the organisation, who create a culture and a system of belief. And if what I'm describing today is a way of thinking about creativity that has in many cases become quite toxic and quite destructive in organisations, then the role of the leader is to reconnect with these other versions of the story. Redefine creativity as something that is collective, that is not just about novelty, change, rupture, disruption. There's no such thing as a creative person, and there's no such thing as an uncreative person in this version. It's a false dichotomy. So this is Fuseli's nightmare, and my idea is that's the uncreative little goblin sitting on top of the creative dream. We need to learn to fail and learn from failure as well, and integrate that idea of painful reconstruction from destruction into the creative process. We need to also think about the importance of uncreative intermediaries. So business process re-engineering that strips out all those middle managers that we don't need anymore. Maybe they're quite important, actually, in a creative process. And in particular, Edward de Bono's idea in The Six Thinking Hats of there being this person in the creative team who wears the black hat, who's the critic, who's the negative, boring one, who says, no, we can't do that. Actually, that is a really important person in the creative team, as I'm sure you'll all have come across that person. Maybe you are that person. We also need to get away from this idea that creativity is always thinking outside the box. Margaret Bowden describes creativity as taking place in a bounded conceptual space. And you work within those constraints, and it's by working from inside the box that you transform it, that you reconfigure it. So Picasso doesn't just invent cubism from somewhere else. It happens from within a set of traditions and skills that he has. We also need to recognise perhaps the importance of being creative enough. It's not always important, necessary, to come up with something radically new. Sometimes you need something that works, that does the job. And we need to recognise the possibilities and the necessity sometimes for slow innovation and incremental change. And we need to think about how creativity has to be embedded in the resources that we have, the values that we have, the context within which we're working. It's not coming from somewhere else. It's not coming from some separate, special place. If we want to be creative, we have to learn to be uncreative. Thank you.